Great. Um, yes, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in today to join us. We're going to be hearing from Alex today to speak a little bit about his work and listening to rights holders and some of the invasive species work he's been doing in the Great Lakes on lamprey. So my name is Nick Wong, and I'm the manager of science and research with the Invasive Species Council of BC. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we're all coming in and joining today from different traditional territories across the province. But I would like to recognize that I'm extremely grateful to be joining you all from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coquitlam First Nation, where I get to live, work, and play. I'd also like to acknowledge that this webinar is supported through our project with the Pacific Salmon Foundation. So yeah, thanks very much to them for supporting this. Before I introduce Alex briefly, I'll just give a couple Zoom housekeeping items. If you do experience any sort of technical issues with Zoom, please go ahead and use the chat box, and my colleague Megan that is running in the background is tech support, and she'll see if she can assist you. Also, everyone is currently muted, so you should only be able to hear myself and Alex. Um, in Zoom, you have the option to select speaker view or gallery view at the top of the screen, and we tend to recommend speaker view. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be taking some time at the end of Alex's presentation to allow him to answer questions. And if you see questions in the box that you like, you can thumbs up, you can upvote those and bump them to the top of the list. If we do run out of time today to address all of the questions, we'll share those and the responses back via email. And finally, we'll be recording this webinar. So if you want to watch again or share with your colleagues or through your networks, it'll be hosted on our YouTube channel pretty soon. But at this point, I'm pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to Alexander Duncan, who's a PhD candidate from the Center for Indigenous Fisheries Unit at UBC's Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. Alex has committed his academic career to meaningfully contribute and support Indigenous fisheries across Turtle Island, especially given the rising tensions over resource use and access. Part of the 3I project, his PhD research will focuses on enhancing the collective understanding of Indigenous perspectives and experiences with sea lamprey and their control in the Laurentian Great Lakes. Alex currently sits on the International Association for Great Lakes Research's board of directors as the Canadian student member. So, yeah, very excited to have you here with us today, Alex. And yeah, please take it away.
Thanks for the introduction and good morning, everybody. I'm just gonna bring up my slides here. Okay, I'm guessing that's up. I can see it on my end. Um, yeah, my name's Alex Duncan, as Nick mentioned, and I've been working in the Great Lakes for quite some time. I'm originally from the Great Lakes. This picture actually was taken on the First Nation I'm from, the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation, and yeah, it's been great. I'm currently out here in Vancouver doing this PhD, but Great Lakes is certainly where the heart is and where all my work is. And as Nick also mentioned, I'm going to share a bit about some of that PhD research. Presentation split into two parts, essentially. The first part's just an overview of sea lamprey in the Great Lakes for some folks who might not be familiar with that area or sea lamprey themselves. And then after that, I'll jump into some of the stuff I've been doing for this PhD research. So yeah, pretty far from the West Coast here, Vancouver, where I am. The Great Lakes is a huge expanse of water. I think it's somewhere around 20% of the world's surface freshwater, and it's awesome. I have a picture here on the right that was created by the very masterful Nicole Marie Burton, and it depicts the Great Lakes in a different orientation. And some of my work is looking at flipping the script, I guess you would say, looking at things in a different way, that being invasive species. But I really like this piece of art because it shows us the Great Lakes in an orientation that's unfamiliar, kind of makes you take a pause and think about them for longer than you would have if it was oriented the right way. So in this picture, we have east being at the top and west being at the south, and that sort of reflects this idea that back in the day when indigenous peoples were navigating across the Great Lakes, they used the rising and the setting of the sun to orient themselves as they paddled along in their canoes. So um, yeah, just a nice little picture and to help orient us in the Great Lakes. So given that there's so many jurisdictions around the Great Lakes, right? We have two nations, one province, I think about seven or eight states. And then I don't know the exact amount of First Nations and tribes, First Nations being Canadians and tribes being in the States, but there's well over 120, I'd say. This is just an image showing you the diversity of First Nations on the Canadian side. And then I have Chippewas and Awash circled in there. So that's where I'm from, which is on the shores of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. I'm just gonna share some more around the Great Lakes. So these are some of the Haudenosaunee or the Mohawk nations in the States and Canada. And then this is just depicting some of the tribes on the US side of the Great Lakes. So as you can see, there's a lot of individual nations across the Great Lakes, and we share that with a lot of large cities and a lot of people. It's certainly a great place to live and work. And then now, if we take it a step further, given that there's so many individual First Nations and tribes, it's not too big of a step to think about some of the treaties, all the treaties that took place over time in the area. And as you can see, like 100% of the Great Lakes falls within specific treaty areas and traditional territories. And that's really important when we're considering fisheries management or even invasive species management is all of these different individual communities and sovereign nations in the Great Lakes, and then also all the different jurisdictions. In Ontario, for example, the people who deal with fisheries management are typically the province, different from out west here where it's mostly all federal. The federal government is involved in fisheries in the Great Lakes as far as fish habitat stuff goes, and also sea lamprey control, which I'll get into in a little bit here. So I'm here to talk about sea lamprey. I think they're really cool. They're really ancient type of fish. Lamprey, across the world, I think there's about 40 some odd different species of lamprey. On the West Coast, you guys have Pacific lamprey, and there's a really cool endemic species of lamprey on Vancouver Island called the Vancouver lamprey in the Cowichan Lake system. I believe it, don't quote me on the lake, but it's a system of three lakes on the island. But lampreys are really unique. Sea lamprey in particular, they're native to the Atlantic Ocean. They entered the Great Lakes in the early 1900s as a result of the Great Lakes opening up for international shipping. So uh, we have Niagara Falls in the Great Lakes, and the Welland Canal was constructed to bypass that so boats could move into the upper Great Lakes. And that construction sort of facilitated the spread of these fish throughout the Great Lakes. But yeah, many names for this fish. They're a parasite and they're deemed invasive, so they get the butt end of the stick quite a lot. They're blamed for a lot of issues in the Great Lakes, and while they have contributed quite significantly to those issues, sometimes it's important to understand names because names really impact how we view or we react to a specific being. So sea lamprey being invasive get some pretty outlandish names like bloodsucker, monster, or vampire. Of course, they have their common name, sea lamprey, Latin name Petromyzon marinus, and then given that they're this new being in the Great Lakes, there's not really uh, indigenous words for it. Some people have come up with some words to call them. So we have two at the top there, Ginnabigimeg, which means a snake, and then Bemisi, which means to roll around in mud, which will make sense in a second. These lamprey have a very unique life cycle. I believe most of this life cycle is shared across the different species of lamprey, but I'll just explain it here for reference. So after hatching from eggs, these larval lamprey, they burrow into sediments in river and stream substrates where they remain for quite some time, up to 10 years in some cases. So a really protracted larval stage where they just sort of filter feed on organic matter and detritus that, is flowing downriver rather. After this long larval stage, they'll go through metamorphosis, sort of like a butterfly, I guess, but not as beautiful looking. Well, I guess beautiful to some. But they'll go through metamorphosis, emerge from those burrows, migrate down into the larger body of water. So, like in this context, one of the Great Lakes, and then they'll begin a parasitic feeding stage, which can last around a year, um, where they'll attach onto fish, as shown on my right, rasp away the scales with their interesting mouth, and then begin sucking on the fish's blood and feeding on the blood. During this year-long feeding stage, it's estimated that an adult lamprey can kill up to 40 pounds of fish, um, which is wild. And then if you think about how many eggs these sea lamprey are laying, they can lay up several hundred thousand eggs in a single go. So if you have a mating pair, that's a lot of potential fish, large-bodied fish that are missing from uh, the larger lakes. And I think one of the reasons sea lamprey have been so destructive in the Great Lakes is that they've evolved in the Atlantic Ocean. That's their native range. So they're used to much larger fish and I guess more abundance in fish. So when they came in the Great Lakes, they're a huge problem. Um, Around the early 1900s, the Great Lakes were also suffering from a number of other issues as well, like I mentioned all those different jurisdictions. Multi-jurisdictional chaos was certainly an issue, different jurisdictions doing different things, overfishing and unregulated pollution. All those factors made the Great Lakes in the early 1900s a very precarious place. And then come the sea lamprey, making it to all of the Great Lakes by the late 1930s, really tipped the scales and led to the almost extirpation of certain fish species like the lake trout. So huge issue in the Great Lakes. There's been a very intense control program that's reduced populations by 90% since that time, and I think I'll talk a bit about that's formation. Just one moment. So uh, the Great Lakes were in a state of peril. uh, People began to recognize and started to see the wounds on all these fish and declines in fish populations. So Canada and the US, after a number of failed attempts, finally came together in the 50s through a treaty called the Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries that established this binational commission, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, uh, which the logo is right there in the middle. Um, and this commission was tasked with the coordination of fisheries management, research, and then sea lamprey control. And to do this sea lamprey control, they contract out in Canada the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So those are the control agents, the people, boots on the ground actually doing the control measures. And then on the US side, it's the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And as I mentioned, a reduction in 90% of sea lamprey from peak population. This program operates on suppression, not eradication. As you can imagine, it's a very big area of the Great Lakes, and eradicating these fish is would be very expensive and almost impossible. So they operate on a basis of suppression, and I'll talk about some of the ways they control these sea lamprey. But at the time of the formation of this commission, and then up until relatively recently in Canada, at least, there's been fairly little involvement of First Nations within this governance structure, which has its own issues. In the States, there's several intertribal organizations. So these, I guess conglomerate's the right word, but these collectives of tribes that do fisheries work and have been involved with the Fishery Commission here since the 80s. But on the Canadian side, it's a relatively recent thing. So uh, to be so successful, it's interesting. There's a number of different ways to monitor sea lamprey populations and then to control them. But Since the 50s, when this commission was formed and the control program began in earnest, there's really only two control measures that have stood the test of time and are still actively used today, just because they're so effective. So on the left, we have these purpose-built dams or barriers that block the spawning migrations of sea lamprey. So after they're done the parasitic feeding stage, they'll go up rivers to spawn. Um, Interesting enough, they're not like salmon. They don't hone to their natal stream. They'll just uh, travel until they find a suitable stream to spawn in based on the presence of their larva. If the river's already infested, the larvae excrete pheromones, and the adult lamprey pick up on those and can, I guess, tell if there's baby lamprey there. The system has some good conditions to spawn in. But yeah, on the left we have the dams. These purpose-built dams. Sea lamprey aren't very good jumpers, so there's uh, dams will block these spawning migrations and protect a lot of upstream habitat. And then on the right, which is certainly the more controversial of the control approaches to control, is the application of pesticides into infested rivers. So there's two types of pesticides that they use, both suited for different conditions, but often used in unison. These pesticides target the larval stage of the lamprey. Such a mentioned it's such a long larval stage where they're filter feeding in these riverbeds and sediments that they're an easy target for control. So essentially, they just inject these chemicals into rivers to eradicate the larval sea lamprey. Uh, the lampricide, a number of rivers have been identified as infested or potentially infested, and then there's these annual sampling and monitoring efforts that determine infestation rates and whatnot. But typically, if it's a big enough river and it has ideal sea lamprey habitat and there's not a dam, um, that those rivers will be treated every 1 to 3 years with these chemicals. And with both control measures, as you could imagine, uh, there there are some unintended consequences. You know, dams are pretty destructive to river habitats. They fragment them, alter hydrodynamics, block uh, spawning migrations of native fish. And then, of course, pesticide uses. These pesticides were specifically created to target lamprey, and they're very effective at killing lamprey. However, there are some non-target impacts when applying these chemicals. So that's another issue, but it's a trade-off, I guess, a balancing of the sword. You know, if we're not treating these rivers or damming these rivers, the amount of lamprey that would go back into the system, into the Great Lakes, would cause significant declines in native fish species. So, yeah. I'll talk a bit about the dams. So the Great Lakes as a system as a whole has a lot of dams. These are clusters of dams across the Great Lakes. But out of these thousands of dams, only about 500 are considered critical to the sea lamprey program. So blocking important sea lamprey habitat in rivers. And these dams protect just over 50,000 kilometers of upstream habitat in the Great Lakes. So a lot of good lamprey habitat cut off by these dams, just to give you an idea. And then lampricides, so those little shields with pluses are the rivers in the Great Lakes that receive lampricide treatments or have in the past. So quite quite a widespread all across the Great Lakes. And if we think back to this treaty map I showed, you know, a lot of this occurs on, within, across Indigenous territories, whether that be traditional territories, treaty areas, or even reserve lands. And, you know, there's been this huge push as of late to better incorporate and include Indigenous peoples, not just as um, excuse me, sorry, but just including Indigenous people as equal decision makers in fisheries management and invasive species management, and then this push towards two-eyed seeing. So I think I have a slide after this that explains what that is, but that's just essentially putting Western science and Indigenous science or Indigenous knowledge on equal footing and using them together to achieve mutual benefits and desired outcomes and whatnot. So there's just a paper there by this lady Charity Knox who we'll talk a bit about actually. She was involved in the larger project here, but it's just a nice paper of hers talking about two-eyed seeing and sea lamprey management or stewardship in the Great Lakes. Um, yeah, just a slide. There's a nice paper by Reed et al. In 2021 that talks about two-eyed seeing and some of these other um, multiple knowledge systems thinking sort of stuff. Yeah, so now I'm gonna just switch over to some of the research I've been doing. So, um, given that there's this large push for more indigenous aligned or indigenous connected approaches to natural resource management, the use of this two-eyed seeing, um, a group of uh, several people actually, representatives from the control agents. So those are the people who are contracted to do the control, like DFO or US Fish and Wildlife Service. Um, Academics and indigenous academics came together and applied to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, that binational commission I mentioned, to engage in some research about, uh, just improving our understanding of indigenous perspectives, experiences with sea lamprey and their control. So this group of folks were awarded funding, I believe, in 2021, and then since then, I've been involved in this, and it's been great. Every summer, I get to live out of a tent by choice. On the shores of the Great Lakes and move from community, First Nation and tribal community to community, and just engage with them, do the research, of course, but yeah, just be present in the Great Lakes and with all these lovely people. But yeah, the impetus of this research was to just collect some general information on people's feelings, attitudes, experiences with sea lamprey and sea lamprey control, and those people being the indigenous folks of the Great Lakes. Um, this work was guided by an advisory council. So we have four Indigenous women from the Great Lakes. There's a number of different cultures in the Great Lakes, or even like language speaking groups. Like we have Ojibwe, we have Haudenosaunee, Potawatomi, uh, and a common theme across those, and in particular for Ojibwe people or Anishinaabe people, women have a very sacred connection to water. So just having this having that context and then also just having these awesome individuals help guide this work was really awesome. And we received a lot of guidance and it was great. But that's our advisory council for this work. Um, when we began the project, the first sort of activity that was undertaken was this virtual gathering where we tried to bring people together just to get a baseline understanding of what's going on with Indigenous peoples and sea lamprey, if there is anything going on in the Great Lakes. So, um, excuse me, on the top right, I have a QR code to the report itself. Um, and in this, the report for the workshop, and in the gathering we had, the workshop, we had these three invited speakers on the bottom, and those are QR codes to their recorded uh, testimonies, I guess, maybe not testimonies, but we had them share stories about sea lamprey in their own context, and then we showed those to the workshop participants and just got some feedback. Um, and people, talked about sovereignty, relationships with sea lamprey, and what the sea lamprey control program should look like moving forward. Uh, yeah, it was really interesting just to get things going, and that occurred in March of 2023. Um, I'm going to talk about some of the other projects because this was uh, a grant and there were other students who were doing work. So I mentioned Charity earlier. She has some papers that she produced, and what she looked at was a rehabilitation project of a sea lamprey barrier in southwestern Ontario, actually with my nation, where the the dam was in a pretty poor state and needed to be improved. And the initial improvement plan or rehabilitation plan didn't include the local First Nations. And after some conflict, I guess, uh, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission sort of stepped in and sort of mediated a better relationship. And then this dam rehabilitation project went forward in a good way and was successful. So there's a video about it. I think it's like 7 minutes long on the bottom there. Another student, Hannah Postma, she interviewed fisheries professionals who were working for Indigenous natural resource or fishery departments across the Great Lakes. And then Noah Gautier, I have Hannah's thesis, the QR code thing there. And then Noah Gautier, who was trying to look at, or not trying, sorry, he did. He just hasn't published anything yet, investigating Indigenous perspectives on genetic control. So, genetic control has been proposed as a solution to the sea lamprey problem, but of course, with any intervention like that, it comes with controversy, and really any sort of invasive species management action you do has to rely on social license. If the citizenship of a given nation is opposed to uh, an approach, then that sort of makes it more difficult to do or successfully, I suppose. So social license is a huge thing, and there's I would say waning support for genetic control just generally across North America and perhaps the world, I guess. So yeah, I mentioned I sort of hop around to different communities and engage with them on sea lamprey. This has been the bulk of my work. I'm from the Great Lakes. I'm from a specific First Nation, but there's such a diversity of nations, and given that I'm an outsider as an academic, but then also an insider as a somewhat local in the Great Lakes. You do have to build a relationship to really engage with these communities, and there's a long history of really extractive research taken part on that's taken place, sorry, on Indigenous peoples, um, and that's created a sort of mistrust. So trying to be uh, a forthright rather, and really build these relationships has been important. And if you build a relationship with the community, it doesn't just end at the end of the project. These relationships blossom and move on to into other areas of inquiry or what have you. Um, yeah, it's been really cool. I've really enjoyed it, but it takes some time. It's not a very quick process building these relationships. If you're going to do it in a meaningful way and not just come in, extract knowledge, and leave. An important component, is making sure that the community has some benefit to this. So, like for me, I'm a student, and this is serving the needs of my PhD and some, personal motives to improve fisheries in the Great Lakes. But, what does the community get out of it? And that's an important component, I think, in all aspects of work with Indigenous communities. Like if it's sort of like a you help me, I help you sort of deal. So that's very important. Um, this is just some guiding principles and values, I guess, for the research. So, uh, being in community for a long time, that's typically not super normal for researchers. So I would spend a 2 weeks, 3 weeks in each community and just be present and connecting with everyone, tailoring the research to community needs, making sure they benefit some way. Um, and yeah, just and reinforcing this idea of reciprocity uh, has been important to this work. So for the work itself, maybe I should say what I do is I'd partner with these communities, um, go into the community, work with usually someone at their fisheries office or lands department, um, and then get I guess maybe like a short list of community members who have some connection to the fishery, the waters, or invasive species generally, I guess, and then go and interview those folks. So that's the data collection part of my research was interviewing these people from all these different communities. I think at the end of the project here, we have about 5 communities and a lot of interest to continue this work in other contexts. Um, and yeah, it's been great when I'm working in these communities. You know, some of them have I wouldn't say a strong relationship with DFO, but some of them have a working. I'm going to focus on Canada, just for reference. But some communities had a working relationship with DFO, who does the control measures in the Canadian on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes, and then I had some communities that had very uh, like not a lot of connection with DFO, maybe no relationship at all, and were completely unaware of some of uh, these control measures occurring in their territory. Um, so this is just on the right. There's a picture of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Just further west, there's a community on the shores of Lake Superior, and uh, I started working with them, and they had found out during that time that the rivers in their territory, which, as I was talking about earlier, often are pretty large and often much larger than the reserve itself. But when I started working with them, they came to learn that these control measures, so the chemicals in the rivers in particular, were happening in their territory without their knowledge, without any sort of engagement from the control agents, the DFO, or even the larger governance structure, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And that was the same for a number of different communities, including my own. Um, Through this work, we found out that these control measures, so namely the chemicals and then some dam stuff as well, have been occurring in our territory since the 50s, and there's been zero consultation and just overall neglect to our place, our sovereignty as a nation. So that was a really big issue that I came across and um, needs to be addressed, honestly. That's their legal mandates for consultation if management actions have a potential to infringe on rights. There's treaties with their own stipulations across the Great Lakes. It's just a huge conundrum, it seems like, in the Great Lakes. But some communities, like Garden River First Nation, have a working relationship with DFO and are given notice when their rivers are being treated. But just back to this thing I talked about mutual benefit, some of the things that I go into a community and they'll ask for just information usually. So what I've made are the series of control reports. So I'll just essentially be like, hey, like what rivers, what's your territory, where's the delineation marks, like how can like what rivers do you want to learn more about with respect to sea lamprey control? Excuse me. And I'll just extract out all the relevant information I could find, put it into this maybe 20-page report and give it back to the community as their own sort of resource to use. And I've been doing this with the communities I partner with, and it's a great way just to have really accessible sorry, information, but maybe something that the folks who are doing the control should be doing rather than me. But yeah, the reports have been really awesome, and it's a good way to learn about the history of control uh, in a given area. So I don't know the exact amount of interviews I've done to date, but like I said, 5 communities, so quite a bit of information that I've gathered. Overall, I think communities just want a higher level of engagement, and I was talking about these communities who have no or very little knowledge of this invasive species management program that's happening within their territory. People just want to be kept in the loop, notified, um, have some sort of coordinated, outreach and education on what sea lamprey are and um, what the control program is. In the Great Lakes as a system, sea lamprey are pretty well known. Like most people, I think, who have a connection to the waters would probably have an understanding of what a sea lamprey is, but the sea lamprey control program itself is maybe a little further outside of the public's view. Unless you're, on these rivers every day of the year, you wouldn't really see some of the stuff happening. But yeah, lots of really good information. Maybe not so surprising, given that the First Nations and tribes of the Great Lakes are so connected to their waters and rely on fishing still as a livelihood and for food, there is a pretty strong support for the control program itself. People recognize sea lamprey as a threat to the native fish species, and I guess by extension, there's very deep connections and relationships these communities have with the fish in their local areas, but a strong support for the control program itself. However, just a need for better consultation and engagement on the control itself when it's happening in a given territory or traditional area. Um, a lot of the times, what will happen, control will be scheduled in a territory, and these communities won't be notified unless that control occurs on reserve. So if there's a river going through the reserve and that's being treated, that's when DFO, by their admission, will engage with the community. But there just needs to be this recognition for these larger boundaries around reserves. Um, I think it's a really critical time because we're doing this work here, which is bringing this to light. But the fact that there's these communities who've been left in the dark and haven't been engaged, there's a huge potential for those communities to take legal action, for the lack of consultation or for the lack of free, prior, informed consent. Uh, that could potentially slow down the control program. For instance, when my community found out that our rivers were being treated, I think they had a schedule plan for two rivers in our territory in 2023. Um, we approached the DFO and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and said, "Hey, we found out about this. We haven't been properly engaged or consulted, and we're not gonna allow you to treat this river until you engage with our membership and consult with us." And they did. They did abide by that, which was really nice, and it led to some great discussions and interactions with the community. But when you don't treat a river on a scheduled year, there's a huge potential for sea lamprey to get back out into the water and have an impact. During COVID, for example, the control teams on the Canadian side couldn't reach parts of, I think, Lake Ontario. And in the next couple of years, the marking rates on certain fish rose quite dramatically from the lack of this control on rivers. So, excuse me, you know, organizations that have to do invasive species management, they should be proactive and engaging communities as early as possible. And if you have a program that's been around since the 1950s, you have to really put a lot of energy into engaging with those communities and being upfront as to why they haven't been involved for so long. And if you don't do that, you have the potential to really halt um, this invasive species management program and cause a lot of unintended consequences. So, for an organization like the Fisheries Commission or for the DFO, they really need to be proactive and start building relationship with these communities to avoid undue conflict and years and years of hard work. Um, so, um, why why engage First Nations? I mean, I think there's a lot of obvious answers to this. There's legal mandates, treaties, but there's so much benefit to doing that. I was just talking about the potential for conflict or barriers to management actions being successful over time. That's a huge one. If it they have there's a potential to start up a legal case, and that could really backlog a lot of progress that's been made. So, and it is these communities' honest right to take legal action if they see fit. But if you if these agencies involved in invasive species, we're proactive in building those relationships, uh, conflict would be avoided. It took us not allowing sea lamprey control in our territory for a year, uh, like to build a relationship. My nation had discussed taking legal action, but it was in everyone's best interest just to, build a relationship, get to know one another, and then come up with a mutually agreeable decision. And in the context of my nation, we had committed with the DFO and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission to draft up an MOU, memorandum of understanding, just to outline what our relationship is like moving forward and just making sure certain things are met, like data sharing and whatnot. But yeah, other reasons, there's this huge source of knowledge within these communities. They've been in those areas for the most part for since time immemorial or time out of mind, and have developed this really deep and rich source of knowledge. They're also in the Great Lakes. A lot of communities are out there every day fishing for trade, for commerce, like a commercial fishery or for food. And they're going to see what happens a lot earlier than a lot of other sectors of society. So this contribution of traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge could really benefit an invasive species management program. Um, you know, I talked a bit about two-eyed seeing, so that kind of loops in this indigenous ecological knowledge. And yeah, I think it's really important to do. And that's, obviously a huge focus of my work. Um, so that was the Three Eye Project. We call it the Three Eye Project. The three eyes being Indigenous inclusion and input. Um, that's ending this year. Like the end of the grant ends, and we've just recently been awarded another grant to continue this work. So, continue to contribute to the collective understanding of the relationship Indigenous peoples have with sea lamprey and control across the Great Lakes. I mentioned I was partnered with 5 communities. There's a lot more than 5, right? So we're going to continue this work and continue to build on those relationships we already have. And then within these partner communities or with the pre-existing relationships that our group has, we're going to try and identify priorities and really support community-based initiatives or research into sea lamprey control. Give money to these communities so they could hire a community researcher to, look at a specific aspect of sea lamprey or sea lamprey control within their territory. So this is, I guess, the next steps moving forward. And yeah, I think that's it. I usually like to share this picture. The news is oftentimes you see it quite often in the news, actually, these clashes between indigenous nations, indigenous peoples, and these sort of dominant regimes, whether that be the Canadian government or Department of Fisheries and Oceans out east or out west. Um, this is something to avoid. It doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be a battle over, um, you know, land and territory and water with these dominant regimes. This can be avoided, I think, if we, take our hats off at the door and really embrace building relationships and working together in a good way so that we can protect our environments for generations to come. So yeah, doesn't have to be like this, but it's a cool picture, so I like to share it. Yeah, I think I'm at the end here. So, uh, Miigwech, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions, I guess.
Oh, thanks very much, Alex. Yeah, your work is pretty inspiring, and yeah, getting to be on the land and interacting with so many, and to share your work, and you can really tell you're passionate about it. Amazing way to end too. That's some pretty powerful stuff. Especially that image. Yeah. Um, there are a couple questions in the chat here, and for those, yeah, in the room, there's totally an opportunity to ask questions. We can unmute you if you'd like. Just let us know there. But yeah, I'll just start with a couple of the 2 questions in the chat, Alex. So, are the dams constructed exclusively to prevent the lamprey migration? It seems like though something like that could be pretty costly.
Yeah, so some of them are purpose built, and a lot of like the existing dam or barrier infrastructure, even in the 50s, there were dams, private dams, all sorts of dams for different things, mill dams, what have you. But yeah, some of them are purpose built, and then some of them are just, already there. And then even too, you could think about waterfalls like natural barriers are already present within the area. But yeah, it is really expensive. The program as a whole is extremely expensive, and that funding is comes from both the U.S. and Canada. I think it's protected somehow. Like there was a bunch of DFO layoffs during the recession 2008, whatever, or maybe it was even more recent than that. I've heard about these huge layoffs, but the control program is usually protected from those as it's, pretty critical for the health of the Great Lakes.
Okay, interesting. Okay, well, it's good that funding is protected. You don't always see that. And sometimes invasives are kind of the first thing to be cut from a budget, unfortunately, it seems. Okay, are there things you've learned maybe about processes or relationship building that was happening in the US that we could learn from in apply in Canada?
Um, Interesting. Yeah, sometimes it often just takes like an individual. So there's this individual who works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Sean Nowicki, and she's really in her career elevated relationship building with communities, and that's really made a lot of improvements. But the U.S. is a totally different context. They had a lot of court rulings in the 80s that gave rights back to tribes and treaty areas. And like in Michigan, they have the consent decree rather. And there's also, I guess, maybe a consolidation of management power. So there's, I think, three or maybe more than three. There's a few different intertribal agencies that represent different tribes. So one is the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So they represent about 11 tribes, I believe. So when they had these court rulings in the 80s, they just, I guess, got into the Great Lakes governance structure. They sit on lake committees and stuff, and their treaty areas are quite large. It's a little different from Canada, but yeah, I think it just takes honestly like one or two people to really push the ball forward. I think there's some rigid, I don't know, structural stuff in management agencies as you could imagine, but just takes like an innovative and I guess encouraged individual to sort of shift that.
Hmm.
And we're certainly seeing that now on the Canadian side. It's moving towards a good place, I think, for sea lamprey.
Okay, great, great. Um, just going back here. Okay. Two more questions that I've noticed. Are there any examples of local First Nations along lamprey infested or suitable habitat waterways getting involved in sampling and monitoring surveys? If not, is there a possibility in the near future?
Yeah, so I mean, I showed those maps. It would be hard to say there's a First Nation in the Great Lakes basin that doesn't have a river that has been or is infested with sea lamprey. Like that's how widespread they are. I know of a couple examples. So around Sault Ste. Marie, that's where their sea lamprey control headquarters is, the DFO in Sault Ste. Marie. It used to be in London, Ontario, like long, long time ago. But the communities around there have, I'd say, some of the strongest working relationships just based on proximity. So yeah, they're like Garden River, for example, is essentially right beside Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and Garden River. They they're more so involved with monitoring. They're part of the supplemental control project and whatnot. But this comes after a very checkered history. They essentially said no to sea lamprey control in the 2010s for quite some time, and that caused a lot of sea lamprey to get back into the Great Lakes system. But they had their own reasons for doing it, and they have the right to.
Hmm.
But after that sort of ban on control, there's been renewed interest to build that relationship. So they are involved somewhat. Um, in the States, tribes typically collect information, so they'll pull traps at dams and report on sea lamprey numbers and whatnot. Most fisheries management agencies across the Great Lakes, and First Nations included, report wounding rates on trout. So it's a nice index of abundance, marks per 100 lake trout. But yeah, there's not a huge amount of examples of First Nations contributing to monitoring. And I think that's one of the big things we're hearing is, you know, they might not want to sit at the big decision-making table, but they at least want to be involved with monitoring their environment and seeing any changes that happen over time. So it's certainly I think it is coming in the very near future with some of these, memorandums of understanding or these renewed relationships with the DFO. So,
Yeah, great. Well, hopefully
yeah,
your new project and grant can support some of that, establishing those
exactly.
priorities.
That's the idea. Yeah.
Great, great. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that question. All right, Deanne, how are young people in indigenous communities being engaged in invasive species management, particularly with respect to traditional ecological knowledge, just I guess in the context of the communities you've been working in?
Yeah, youth are often the most vocal. Um I make a point of including at least one or two youths in my interviews with communities just to get that perspective. And yeah, they're like super huge advocates. Um, their involvement, I guess, I, in a lot of communities, they'll have like a summer student program, right? So someone will get hired on to this natural resource or fisheries office, and I'd see involvement that way. Um, but yeah, I guess just outreach and a advocacy. I think youth are sharing their minds often very freely, and so uh, yeah, I of course like to see more. Like with this new grant, we're certainly going to try and help facilitate some hirings of youth to do this work, engage with their own community and figure that sort of stuff out. But yeah.
They can be your champions.
Mhm.
Right on. Okay. Thanks, Deanne. Question from Dave. Are recreational fishers engaged in any lamprey reporting program or other sort of related projects?
Um, I believe they can report. Like, it's pretty common to get a fish. Like, I'll fish downrig, whatever. Like, it's pretty common to get a fish with a wound. Like, I don't know, if you go fishing 20 times, you'll probably get five where you'll have a wound if you're fishing on the big lake or in some of the rivers. And I believe there is a way for rec fishers to report that. But most of like the population index comes from, this like the monitoring and whatnot that the DFO or Great Lakes Fishery Commission does. They used to have a sort of bounty program where they would pay commercial fishers if they had any lampreys, which I thought was really cool. One of the communities I work with, they were thinking about doing a bounty.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know, you get a gift card or $10 for every lamprey you can bring back. Because when they're spawning, like there's hundreds in the river.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, and another thing too in the Great Lakes, there's a huge need for more social sort of human dimensions work. Social science, as far
Mhm.
as fisheries is concerned, is
Mhm.
it's a very fledgling sort of discipline in the Great Lakes. It's mostly, your hardcore quantitative mathematical fisheries management sort of stuff. But there is a huge need, and there's been calls for the last few decades to improve that. So hopefully, it's a nice way to involve rec fishers as well as interviewing them and seeing what they have to share.
Okay. Okay. Very cool. And lastly, thinking about lamprey biology itself, how might do you have any idea, been studies on climate change influence on populations and management? Any, I guess, respect to the Great Lakes?
Yeah, so the Upper Great Lakes, Lake Superior is known to be very cold. Um, if you've been there, swam there. But the lamprey distribution across rivers there, they're present, but not in the same sort of numbers as other Great Lakes that are warmer. So there's an idea that as the water's warm, they'll be able to spread further and maybe further upriver or what have you. So that's one um, I guess, sort of influence. Um, Sea lamprey have sort of, or not sea lamprey rather, but lamprey in general have sort of like an anti-tropical distribution. They're mostly found in like temperate and Arctic regions. So I guess they're used to the cold water, but if water warms, I guess they can move further up north, colonize further,
Mhm.
if there's not total blocks of these river systems. So I would say, yeah, migration northward, I guess would be a concern there or an influence. Yeah.
Okay, okay. And yeah, just one question from myself, if that's all right. Yeah, so the lamprey have in the past really impacted, you mentioned lake trout populations. With all the management that's been happening over the decades, are they rebounding? Are they doing better? Or is it still with all the confounding factors still struggling.
I would say the Great Lakes as a whole are struggling. There's been declines in a lot of fish that aren't really associated with management, really, or maybe mismanagement. Invasive species are a huge issue in the Great Lakes. I think
Okay.
we have over like 180 invasive species, and some of the big ones are like the dreadnought mussels that, take out things from the water and really make it clear. But yeah, so I'm not sure when this began, but there's been a really huge initiative to repopulate the Great Lakes with lake trout following the disaster of sea lamprey control. So in each lake, they have a rehabilitation program. Um, Actually, just last year, Lake Superior was deemed as an official success in terms of rehabilitating lake trout. So by rehabilitating they'll do some like reef reconstruction. I think the Buffalo Reef in Lake Superior. I think that's what it's called. But for the most part, it's just
Okay.
stocking of these fish. So yeah, Lake Superior deemed a success. I'd imagine the others as well. Like it was pretty dire in a lot of the lakes, the lake
Mm.
trout populations after that initial invasion by sea lamprey. So yeah, we're doing better with lake trout. Some of our other fish species are having a rough time.
Okay. Okay. All right, and yeah, just one final question popped in. Have Indigenous communities discovered ways to utilize sea lamprey at all, either as some sort of resource or something within practices or
That's a good question. Like on the West Coast here, the Pacific lamprey is really important to some of the tribes in the Columbia River Basin, like the Yakima, I think, and the Umatilla. Um, Sea lamprey are so new in the Great Lakes. Well, I guess not so new anymore, but there's not really any uses. In their native range sea lamprey along the Atlantic coastlines of North America and Europe, different communities would harvest and consume them. They were a huge hit in Europe. Like lamprey is a lamprey pie, but in their native range they're imperiled. So it's funny in the Great Lakes we're trying to get rid of them, but their native
Mhm.
range they're trying to save them. Um, but no, in the Great Lakes we have a really big problem with mercury, and these lamprey feed they're opportunistic. They'll feed on a lot of different fish, but they really like large, small-bodied, or not, sorry, large-bodied, small-scale fish. So like lake trout, and we
Mhm.
have stocked salmon in the Great Lakes, so they really like feeding on those. So the concentration of mercury within a given lamprey is really high, and it's not advised to eat them. You might
Gotcha.
get like, yeah.
Okay.
Um, but when I'm speaking with these communities, they're asking these sorts of questions. How can we utilize them rather than just kill them?
Hmm.
Um, they didn't ask to be here. They kind of just showed up, and everyone's out to get them. But what do we have to learn from them? So that's been a common thread throughout all these different communities is trying to, I guess, interrogate what sort of relationship we as Indigenous peoples have with this non-native fish that's recently in our area. So
Yeah. No,
I'd
that's
like to
great.
see some. I'd like to try it. I've never had lamprey, but yeah.
Okay. No, that's I think that's a nice way to end. We demonize these invasive species and it's not their fault they're here. So I think we need to respect them in that sort of way. But yeah, yeah. Yes, a couple kudos and thanks coming into the chat for you, Alex. I just hope, like everyone here, to give Alex a warm virtual round of applause. And yeah, thanks so much for sharing your expertise and your work on your 3i project. And yeah, really hope your new project continues to show great success and yeah, doing great work. Um, if you have any more questions for Alex, we're happy to forward those along. Yeah, some more thanks coming in there for you, Alex. Again, this will be put up on our YouTube channel, and we'll share that via probably our news and some other ways in the future. And yeah, speaking of research, I would just love to do a quick plug that ISCBC has their invasive species research conference happening in May in Kelowna at UBCO. Would love you to join there, Alex, if you're interested. Um, the call for proposals is open, and yeah, the link is in the chat there. But yeah, any final words, Alex, before we let everyone go?
I'll just I guess enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, thanks again to Pacific Salmon Foundation. Thanks to you, Megan, for tech support and all the good questions from the attendees. And yeah, have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.